Welcome to our virtual author event with author Craig Davidson. I now would like to introduce our first presenter for tonight, Brianna Moore.
Hi guys, I'm Brianna. If you haven't seen me before, I'm one of the adult reference librarians here at the Oceanside Library, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's guest, Craig Davidson. Craig is a Canadian author of short stories, literary fiction, and horror novels. All of this written under his given name and pen names, which you may know him as Nick Cutter or Patrick Lestuska. Now, some of you may be familiar with his work, such as his 2005 collection of short stories, Rust and Bone, which was adapted into a play and then a movie starring Marion Cotillard. Also, our Oceanside book club called On the Same Page with Deb and Nay, who are here with us today, featured Saturday Night Ghost Club as our September 2020 pick. Now, for those who don't know about this book, Saturday Night Ghost Club, it was published by Penguin Random House in 2018. The US got their release date in 2019. And it's about a coming of age story about a young teen named Jake and his uncle Calvin, along with a few friends who explore haunted sites in Niagara Falls, also which they call Cataract City. But there's more to the book than that. It touches upon several themes I hope that we get to discuss tonight. So, Craig, I'm so happy to have you here with us. But for our viewers who don't know you or don't know your don't are new to your work, can you
Hmm?
start us off with how you came into writing? Was that like a plan, or this was something born from another adventure?
Um, that's a good question. I would say for me, yeah, it's been something that I was probably that kid who, I mean, I always when I do a library event, I make sure to be very thankful for the libraries in general because obviously for writers, libraries are sort of the lifeblood in many ways of what we do, libraries and independent bookstores. And so, I spent a ton of time as a kid. My mom would drop me and my brother off on Sundays at libraries, and we would just haunt the libraries, haunt the stacks. And as we got older, I got older, especially. The high school library, the junior high library became sort of like refuges and places where I didn't hide out there. There was thankfully no need for me to do that. I just enjoyed kind of the ambiance of a library, and I've worked as a librarian earlier in my 20s. So sort of I guess it was a lifelong obsession or love of books. Having read a ton of books, you sort of you just think, well, it'd be interesting if you could try your hand at it. And in high school, I was very fortunate to have a really committed. I grew up in St. Catharines, Ontario, which is not too far away from Niagara Falls, where most of my stuff is set. And we were really lucky to have, way back then, a creative writing program that one of the English teachers just put together of her own free will, thinking that it would be interesting for her, but they were really uncommon at that point. And so I joined that, and I was not a particularly exceptional student in any way, and I think she was as surprised as I was when she sort of came to me one day and said, I'm shocked to be saying this, but you're not awful at this. You seem to have some facility as a writer. And so from there, and I've said before, as encouraged, as helpful as that encouragement was, and as meaningful and validating it was to me, when I was in my 20s and all my other buddies had got jobs and were established moving forward in careers that had now become their vocation, and I was struggling mightily to even sell stories. I thought, oh, I wish you had just said that I was terrible at this. But the truth is, I think for most of us who you've interviewed or most authors who you probably speak to, it's a to not make it cliche, but it's somewhat of a calling. It's something that you really feel deep down that if you don't do it, you're gonna feel like you've left something on the table, or your life maybe has some sort of gap in it. So steadily over time, I just kept working at it and working at it, and got better. I think obviously at some level, um, and then started publishing short stories, and then I got an offer for a novel, and then since then, sort of, nip and tuck, touch wood. I've made a career at it. I'm here at our house in Toronto with my wife, who is a social worker. And so she's sort of got the career that is really solid and is sort of the sort of career that my parents can look at and say, oh, that's a reasonable thing to do. So I'm sort of the not that career choice, but together we make it work.
Yeah,
And I'm fortunate to be able to do what I do.
that's awesome. So for Saturday Night Ghost Club, it's such an interesting book. What inspired you to write Jake and Calvin's story?
Well, probably a lot of things. Again, any writer will tell you more or less that his or her books probably are. It's something that they're pushed to write. There's some aspect of themselves and their past history in it. There's some sort of problem or obsession that they're kind of working over and maybe trying to solve. I've always said, now I'm in my mid 40s and I know a lot of writers who I got my start in my late 20s. So, sort of 15 years of doing this. And other writers of my vintage, we talk about, why are we still kind of writing in some ways the same stories that we were writing when we were in our 20s or whenever we got our start. And yes, they've changed. I mean, my early stories were kind of about, young men who didn't understand their place in the world and, oh, why doesn't the world understand me sort of thing, which is, I guess, reasonable for that time in my life because if the books got published in my late 20s, it means I was writing them in my mid 20s. And it just felt like those are not subjects or contexts that I would ever want to revisit or write again, but for that time in my life, they made sense. Whereas something like the Saturday Night Ghost Club is really more about family, nostalgia, to a degree, fatherhood, to a degree, father figures, and to a great degree, memory. Just the concept of memory and how memory is really tricky. So I worked for many years at a place called Marineland in Niagara Falls, which is kind of SeaWorld, Canada's version of SeaWorld. And we had an incident years ago when I was like 17 or 16 where I won't get into it, but me and a couple other people were asked to do something by our boss that ultimately was morally, at very least, morally ambiguous. And so I couldn't really even quite remember what the exact event was. So I went and looked up my two friends from back then, and we were all fathers and husbands at that point. And I basically said, like, what happened that day? What did we do? What were we a part of? And you wouldn't be surprised to hear, Brianna, that all of us had a different story, and it really impacted me on this level that like the event is static. The event is something that happened, and you can't change the contours of it. Whatever happened back then happened, but you can change the way that you remember it. And I think all of us remember things differently, to place ourselves in our own history, to remember ourselves versus the person we are now when we want it somehow to correspond maybe with the person we were back then. To let ourselves off the hook, to let other people off the hook, but ultimately sometimes just to disburden ourselves from memories that we have a really difficult time fitting into the framework of our lives. So I think, all of those things, and the fact that I grew up, as I said before, kind of an overweight, kind of library focused, insular kind of a kid, those things all, made the book what it eventually was.
Were there any resources? You already mentioned like this one experience about how your friends have a different memory of this event, but what else helped you create any resources or that helped you create Saturday Night Ghost Club? Because I know one of your books, and the title is slipping my mind, but you learned you were boxing, so you actually
Oh, right.
what
Yeah. Well, yes, those were lost years of um, my life. That was kind of a God. It's almost like I look back and I'm such a cliche at that time. It was my George Plimpton, Hunter S. Thompson experiential journalism phase where I thought if I wasn't doing it myself, it couldn't possibly be real, or you couldn't transmit that, through your writing to the characters that you were writing. So there was none of that with this, other than quite simply, as I said before, I think as you get older, and maybe again, this is not for everyone, and maybe I'm a cliche this way, you become more nostalgic for your past, and the time in which when you were a child where things seemed like they uh, I don't know, we're more black and white. You know, there was less of that shade of gray that ultimately, as an adult, you have to embrace and if not embrace, at least accept that the world sort of operates in shades of gray. You know, and I remember times when I haven't seen my parents, like when you're a child, you can see the outline of the adult world kind of developing around you, and you can hear your parents having certain conversations where it's almost like they're speaking a foreign language, but you can, every third or fourth word you understand, and you can start to feel like this sense of the lives that they live and the idea that they're not perfect and they're not infallible, which is the same. You know, we have an 8-year-old and a 10-month old, and they will eventually discover that if they haven't already, not the 10-month old, but the 8-year-old, they're like, you know, no, dad is not infallible, and dad can't solve all the problems, and nor can mom.
Yeah.
And so, so there's this bittersweet aspect to it, I guess. You know, there's the Amblin side of it, which I love. I think we all love that kind of sense of childhood where children are resourceful and are the victors and kind of operate outside the adult sphere in a way that allows them to um, prevail. And I love that. And there's part of that in the book. And then there's, I guess, the kind of adult sense as well that these kids are speeding towards adulthood and all that that means.
Yeah, you're making me think. I reread your novel before our program. It's interesting because it was the second time I was reading it, and now I feel like Jake as an adult, where he's like recounting these events. So there's parts where he's talking about his mom and dad, and they're whispering or they're giggling because Uncle Calvin's being himself, and now I'm like recalling like at that point he didn't know what was going on, but that's kind of like the mind of a child and younger kid. You don't know what your parents are saying, but you know the words, but not into the context of what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's like it was really cool. That I put that together. I was like, he doesn't even know. Um, but so some of the themes you just mentioned were like fatherhood, being a parent, a family, and memories. Um, when you were writing some of the themes of this book, what was at the forefront while creating this book, and then what kind of came out as a surprise as you finished the novel, like as in terms of themes?
Well, it's interesting with this one because I say in the afterword, I did a PhD in English, and it was a creative writing PhD. So the part basically it was two parts. You had to write a book, or it could have been a brace of short stories or a poetry collection, whatever you felt like that would be, and then you had to write a kind of an academic some linkage to what you'd written, or you could have done it the opposite way. I suppose some people would have just landed on a theory and then written a book around it. I didn't want to do that. I already had a book in mind that I wanted to write, and then I just sort of started looking into really carefully into like doctors' memoirs, neurosurgeons' memoirs. Initially, Jake was just a guy looking back over this summer with his uncle. More or less, it was the same story. I mean, I was really interested in the idea of a person who had disburdened himself of some terrible event, but there was some sharking part in his mind that was not going to let that go and was going to find a somewhat elegant but devious way of making him remember these things. Um, and then as I started, reading these things and reading properties of the brain and just how we recall memories, the idea of memory traces and that, you can Proust is kind of the classic for like he smells the smell of this cookie and then he remembers this event from his childhood and this idea that a smell can bring you back to a point in your life or a taste or the sound of bird song, whatever it happens to be. I found those things fascinating, and so I thought it really made more sense to have Jake be a brain surgeon, and within that, just as you went along and I researched it, the main thing that a lot of the surgeons said in those memoirs and even their kind of more research-based papers is that the brain, our human brain, is the most complex material object in the universe that we know of. So it's like looking down at something that they're at best a mechanic. You know what I mean? They don't understand the brain. It's impossible to understand the brain and all the fathoms that we have as people that are encapsulated up here. So I was amazed at the people who, my wife works at the Sick Kids Hospital here in Toronto, and like the brain surgeons there are just like most of the thoracic surgeons and the rest of the surgeons, transplant surgeons, are seen as these kind of godlike figures, and in some ways they are. They can do amazing things. You know, they can go they can go into a woman's body and actually fix the heart of her unborn baby. You know, so it's like they're capable of amazing things, but at the same level, you know, they don't understand the brain. We will never understand, you know, it. So it's kind of this notion that even Jake, when he's trying to understand what his uncle has done to himself or what his uncle's brain has done to try and save himself, he's helpless. So I guess like it's interesting if you talk to a writer how his or her stories. Some of them come fully formed and then you just write them. Others kind of go through iterations and the characters change, and the plots change even. But ultimately the obsession probably that you're tracking towards stays the same.
Yeah. Um, and I was really thinking about like memory and just growing up. And one of the things that appealed to us about Saturday Night Ghost Club is the books we were reading had like this nostalgia feeling. So we they wanted to go more into that. And but you're asking. I feel like there's something about memory that I guess you're asking the reader or something you were investigating yourself. But was there anything that you were questioning about memory while you were writing and about family? I guess.
I think, yeah, I mean, for sure, memory. I think one thing that you recognize as you go on, and there's so many writers who write really searchingly and beautifully about memory, either you know doctors or you know like someone like Sachs or someone like Tim O'Brien. You know, will go back consistently to his time in the Vietnam War and kind of relook at. I mean, there are things that some writers are. Everybody actually is kind of imprinted by. It's an experience or another person, and they leave that really deep kind of crater-like impact in their life. Hopefully to the good, sometimes not. But I think I've always been fascinated by my own memory and by the memories of others. And it's interesting, as I said, when my early parts of my career were not interested in that at all. You know, I didn't. I was. It was almost felt like it was more surface, and it was about certain things that, again, I look back at, and while they were appropriate to my age, they're just no longer things that motivate me, and I would never want to write about them again. And I think there's probably quite a few writers who would say the same. There would be people. Again, we look back at ourselves at 25, and maybe the things that we were fascinated by at that point, and you look at with the vantage of hindsight 20 years later, and you think, you know, those just things don't motivate me. But you know, family definitely does. You know, it's just honestly, it's just I think it's just a maturation. Thank God, you know, of of me as a person, and certainly my writing sort of follows that. I think you look at a lot of writers, and it's their work changes, and unfortunately, some of the people who maybe followed them early in their career would look at maybe the stuff that I'm writing now and think, what's happened to this guy? He's gone really soft. Um, for me, it's more just my interests have changed, and the things that I want to explore, I guess, through my writing and look at, the aspects of the world that compel me now are different, you know, and more in keeping with, again, fatherhood, being a husband, this time in my life, and then the memories that accrue from that.
Um, it's interesting that you say like because you're talking about things you've written, and I have a question as a writer who writes excuse me as Nick Cutter, and I started reading Little Heaven, and I'm like, whoa, because that's like this Saturday Night Ghost Club was like my introduction to your work, and then I go to Live in Heaven, I was like, oh,
Uh,
okay. Which like I'm starting to see like so like it's one of the questions I kind of don't want to jump to it, but like we're just gonna roll with it.
sure.
Um, do you blend the styles from your because when you write as Nick Cutter, it's pretty much like horror, bit of a thriller sort of. But did you find that interwoven when you're writing Saturday Night Ghost Club? Was that something you had to separate, or like how did you? I guess like how did you just like you could have written that as Nick Cutter, but what made you not?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Um, well, I mean, the Nick Cutter books strangely are personal as well. You know, if you know, I always say with the Nick Cutter is that the biggest influence on me, people will ask a constant question that writers get asked is, who's your biggest influencer, who's the writer? And I'm a kid of the 80s, and so Steve and I had a horror bent, so obviously Stephen King was, you couldn't walk out down the street in the 80s without a Stephen King book hitting back of the head. So I read as much as I could, and my parents, thank goodness, were cool with me reading whatever I wanted. They just were happy with me reading. And so I sort of got on that Stephen King train quite early. And then he led me to all sorts of other, like, Anne Rice and Robert R. McCammon and Clive Barker, Shirley Jackson, all sorts of writers who are sort of in that same sphere, but probably wouldn't have opened them up had I not, had Stephen King not been the key. And so then I had this opportunity to write. I guess I always thought I was going to be a horror book writer, and then my career sort of took a different turn, and then I had this opportunity to come back and have this kind of second life writing, the kind of books I hope that I grew up reading and really enjoying. So Saturday Night Ghost Club is kind of a fusion, I suppose, between the Craig Davidson stuff, in that it's set in Niagara Falls and that sort of deals with some of the same issues, I think, that, say, my earlier book, Cataract City, would have dealt with. But it is harnessed to a very low-key, scary. I guess it's all about your threshold. I don't find it scary. I certainly wasn't writing it to really scare anybody, but one thing I've learned about writing horror is that, or not horror, is that everyone's got a different sort of tolerance, and whatever I feel is like not confrontational or pushing anybody's threshold, I'll hear later, oh, I was really, that scene really bugged me, or bothered me. And if it's in a Cutter book, I'm like, well, that was the point. In a Davidson book, it's sort of like, it's not that I'm surprised.
Okay.
It's and I suppose I can at some level see aspects of the book that we're talking about that'd be like, yeah, that would be concerning. I mean, there's one, it's the Screaming Tunnel, which is actually a landmark from from St. Catharines, Niagara Falls. And I hadn't been there for years, so I took my son, who was 7 at the time, there, which was a bad idea. I mean, we did it in the full light of day. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, but you walk through that tunnel, and I think he was good until he was about halfway through, which is the worst place to, because then you're halfway between getting in and getting out. But we actually ended up walking back the long way to avoid walking through the tunnel again. So it's fine. He wasn't, he wasn't traumatized. There was no nightmares or anything, but he was really like,
You spooked a
and
little.
even I felt it. I was sort of like, I get it, dude. I get it for you, and I even get it for me. So I think, make a long story short, yes.
Okay.
And sorry, Saturday Night Ghost Club is kind of a fusion between the two. It's probably the closest I've ever been to linking the two sides of my writing self.
So, Bree, can I just jump in on that? So, I have to say, so we read this book for our book club, and that scene, I love the references. For instance, the Bloody Mary reference, because I still will not go in front of a mirror and say Bloody Mary, and I'm also in my mid-40s. But I was reading the book at night, and that scene that you just told about the tunnel and the light and the little girl appearing, I didn't sleep all night.
I'm sorry, that was not the intent. But,
I know, but it's so funny because the next day we were talking about it at work, and it was the one thing I said. I was like, I know it's more nostalgic, but those little references, they still play as an adult. They still haunt you in your brain.
Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, yeah, that like there's something just like spooky, and like I feel like that's what works. And sometimes it's like even at such like a nuanced level that it can still be like, so you're still suspicious. So you're like,
right.
Will it happen?
Yeah, exactly. It was purposeful, kind of to be, spooky. I think spooky is probably that was the right that I was going for. But again, I know you guys have had a lot of authors here, and I'm sure they've spoken about all sorts of things. But the one thing is, simplest thing is when you write a book, you lose ownership of it. You know, whatever your intention was, whatever you were trying to say or thought you were trying to say, um, the book as soon as it's published is not yours anymore. It's whoever reads it, and it's however they come to it from their own circumstances of their own life and their own whatever motivates them to pick it up and to read it. And so, you know, I ultimately I had the things that I thought that I was trying to say, and you know, kind of the thresholds that I thought that I was pitching it at. But I recognize now, looking back, there were people, you know, like Debbie, who reacted very similar to you, and I certainly didn't want to create any sleepless nights. That's what Cutter tries to do. But anyways, you're not the only one.
I have a question for, as like, in terms of characters, is there a character you relate with in the book? Like, you seem, I guess, like more similar to.
I'd say Jake is probably the closest to me. I mean, every little character, it's strange. I wouldn't say every character has a part of me in it, you know, in it, but there's an aspect of like, I've said to writers are kind of like magpies, you know, we kind of go around and we pluck little bits of, um, and it can be other people's lives. That's one of the problems with my wife being married to a writer, or you know, you ask permission, but you know, or being the mom or dad of a mom of a writer, because you know, the two parents in this are very closely linked to my parents, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So Jake and you know, obviously I'm not a surgeon, I'm not that, but his childhood in some ways is very similar to my childhood, and some of the stuff that he deals with even in the book are similar to sort of events, fancifully interpreted maybe, but events in my own life. So I've always thought too that it's kind of people will come up and say a given scene sort of resonated with them, and how did they come up with? Why did I come up with it? And often the answer is like I didn't really make it up whole cloth. It was an element from my life. It was a moment from my life. It was an event in my life that I just kind of go back and, again, talking about memory, I remember it in the way that I want to remember it, or in the way that it is in my head, and I kind of take the most galvanic elements of it that I can recall and just put them in the narrative and put them in the characters' hands, and let them kind of relate it. So a lot of that stuff isn't made up per se. It's really remembered from some event in my own life.
Now, was there a character that was, I guess, to get inside that character's head? Which one was, I guess, the most difficult to kind of like understand, bring into being?
I think always for me, female characters are difficult sometimes. You know, I think that there's some women who write really excellent male characters, and there's some men who write really excellent female characters. Generally, I find that, like, you know, like I just finished reading, say, um, The Husband's Secret by Leanne Moriarty, which I thought was excellent. It's not a wonder though that she sticks in the heads of three women, you know, and she's really good at like taking three very different women and very much like living inside their heads and making it feel very authentic. Whereas the men are talked about and they seem authentic as well, but there's no time in which she goes into their heads and kind of, you know. And I thought that was probably a smart move. So in my way too, like, you know, you obviously you in terms of telling a round story, you have to obviously have both sexes, and you have to have all sorts of, you can't be afraid to approach anything. But I mean, Dove was a tricky character for a lot of reasons, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as much as I enjoyed writing Dove, um, you know, it's always like, yeah, can you be in her head? Well, you do your best, obviously, and you do your best to try and you don't want to use her or any characters like
Yeah.
a plot device or a tool or something. You know, I always want to feel like I really, for lack of a better word, you got to love those characters for the time in which they're on the page, and for the time in which you are in their lives and they're in the narrative that you're trying to tell. But yeah, Dove is, I mean, Dove is tough. The women in all of my books have been more difficult. It's just a more difficult, and maybe it's because I got my start writing like really, manly man books. I feel like I can do that, or the boys in the troop. It's like there was a reason I chose the scout troop because I could just isolate them on an island, stay inside the mindset of a boy, and that was like the terrain that I really knew, and I felt like I just have to go back to my own life. Um, so anytime you're stepping out of your own life and your own memory, it's something you need to do as a writer. But I've always found like the terrain is a little more dicey, and you're certainly opening yourself up to fumble a bit more.
Okay. Which is interesting you say that because I'm thinking about Dove, and like, she's such a tough cookie, but like she's very interesting. She had a lot of other things going on.
Well, yeah, I think too. We have here in Canada, we have a very fraught relationship and history with our Indigenous people. Um, it's we just don't have a good historical sort of record in terms of treatment and care for Indigenous communities. So, but yet there's this weird fascination with, I think, with um, the idea of Indigenous populations as they once were, before. Um, back in the 1800s, for example, you know what I mean, when it was more like living in the traditional lifestyle. So, like historical novels up here that deal with Indigenous culture, politics, life are really popular, um, and and uh, and I guess I too am fascinated at some level, and they, for me too, like I grew up in Calgary on the west side of the country, and like Indigenous culture was actually quite, I went to school with Indigenous kids and had friends who were Indigenous, so it felt like a natural thing for me. But my editor was sort of like very. She actually said at some point, maybe we should just make Billy and Dove Yellowbird be like white kids from Northern Ontario,
Hmm.
which is I guess is a fair thing to ask, and a fair thing at least to ask me to consider. Obviously, I didn't do that. But we are at a sensitive time in not just in obviously in world history, in North American history, and certainly writers. Um, I don't want to look back on anything that I've written years later or a year later even and say that was insensitive and that was thoughtless. And I certainly could if I go back to even Rust and Bone, my first book 15 years ago. I'm sure there is stuff in there that will make me cringe because culture has come so far and things have changed so much, and the things that you thought were okay or you thought were reasonable, or weren't offensive, you recognize, well, they really are. So I think there's a lot more within publishers sensitivity and thought given to things like that, as there should be.
Yeah.
um, and especially for me as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant writer, even more so, um, so yeah, I think once again, there's a lot of things that, you come up with an idea for a book, and then you write it or you're working on it, and you encounter obstacles that are based on, if you're lucky, just on, say, the plot that doesn't come together or something. But sometimes there are obstacles or things that you really need to give really due consideration and thought to based on choices that you are making, the conflict with the culture as it now sits. So, you don't want to get paralyzed and not feel that you can write the story you want to. But I'm certainly glad that we think a bit more about the stories we write nowadays than I even did back, when I started.
Yeah. Um, for just the stories you write, is you do a lot of short stories. Now, in your first collection, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You start out with short stories.
Yes.
What do you like about short stories? Because we don't ever really get to talk to authors who are, create
No.
short stories.
it's a rare it's a rare breed. I get my last book was a short story collection too, and um, it's a good question. I mean, I just think some tales come to you, some narratives come to you, and you realize immediately that's a short story. It doesn't quite have the you know fullness really to be even like the San Diego Ghost Club is a short novel. As
Mhm.
novels go, ago, but I knew that was a novel. That was a novel. You know, there are some ideas that come to you that say, well, you really just want to duck in and out of someone's life, find them at a certain point in time, follow them around for a little bit, the people in their lives, and then you get out. And it's a short story. You know, you investigate one sort of discrete aspect of their life or some problem they're facing, and then that's, and it's really, you know, Alice Munro, my fellow countryman, is probably is our best known short story writer, and what she can do in 30 pages or 20 pages is something that a lot of us cannot do in 500. You know, she just has an ability to take something very small or do something with a small parcel of words, and tell a big story. So I do think there's a lot of concision that you need to do with a short story. Unfortunately, they're, for whatever reason, they're just not as popular. Even within publishers, you know, like my short story collection was like, we will let you publish this because it is a good, I don't know, it's a good calling card, I guess. But it's really, we're going to sign you to a novel and we're expecting that the novel, if you do good on that, that's what we're really waiting for, sort of a thing. But I have found that, strangely enough, in Hollywood, they like short story because it's almost like it's a cool character that they found, or they just like the narrative a tiny bit, and then they don't have to cut anything. In fact, it's like they're going to add to it a little bit, put their own stamp on it, and then they've made a movie, or they've got a mini series, and it's amazing sometimes that you can make a whole mini series, and you say, what was it based on? And you go read the story, and it's like 10 pages, you know. So but it gave whoever that creative person who was taking it to the other venue, it gave them everything that they needed. So yeah.
Yeah, now that you say that, because I'm thinking of Rest and Bone, and have the combination of two short stories and a little bit of changes, but like now I can see why it's something they can expand on.
Yeah, and if you look a lot of movies, you'll find, you know, based on the short story by so and so, you know. It, and you know, it unfortunately doesn't always lead to the short story collection getting picked up and read a whole bunch, but in any case, it's good for the writer regardless.
Okay, yeah. How do you feel after having, you know, one of your stories turned into, like, it was a play and then a movie? So like,
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago. It was great. It was wonderful. It was a real, like, I don't know what else you can say, right? I think some authors, if they've got a movie or something made of their book, they're upset with it because it wasn't hidebound or slavish to the book that they've written. You know, to me, it was sort of like they made lots of changes, but I recognized it was in the hands of two really creative people who had their own creative ambitions as well. So the idea that you would be upset that they didn't just do exactly what you did in the book, it's sort of like, well, where do they get off on that? Where's their angle of like creativity or feeling that they have some ownership of the material? And so ultimately, the movie is theirs. Yeah, there's the grain of the stories that is there from the book, but ultimately the book is its own thing, or the stories are their own thing, and the movie that they made is very much its own thing. And they're both cool in their own ways. I really like the movie, so I'm really grateful that they made it.
yeah, I thought that was really cool. I was just like, oh my goodness. And a part of me's like, did I watch that when I was in high school? I can't remember. Watch some stuff because I for a while I was just watching anything with like any French actress, or because I was in like a high level French class. I was like, we're
Oh,
watching
okay.
it. So I was just like, oh, she's in there. I was like, maybe I saw that. I can't remember.
It's great. If you haven't, I think I don't know if it's on Netflix anymore, but it used to be. So I think a lot of people that I know saw it. Just caught it on Netflix one night.
Netflix for the win. We need to check.
Yeah.
So just a couple more questions. Then we have a lightning round. I hope we can get to. Do you have any upcoming projects? Anything we can look forward to?
What am I doing now? Well, I mean, I'm always working on stuff. I don't have any. I have a novel under contract, but I haven't really started working on it right now. I'm kind of doing more screen stuff now. Screenplay stuff, pilots, that sort of a thing. So that's kind of my life has gone that way for a little bit. And obviously during COVID, I think a lot of us are having a difficult time doing our work. You know, it's been going on long enough that we, basically had to pick up ourselves and get working on it. I think most of it. But I have some buddies of mine who haven't set pen to paper or
Yeah.
fingers to keypad during this whole period because it's just such a weird, destabilized time in life. And So, I would say my productivity has been down a little bit, but I've been consistent. But yeah, no, there's unfortunately nothing. Oh, sorry, I guess I would say next year the short story collection comes out in America. So that will be something that comes out. It's a stateside debut will be next year.
Um, and then I think, Debbie, I don't know if I should include this in the lightning round or like we're gonna put it in the lightning round.
Put in the
Okay.
lightning.
We're gonna put it in the lightning round. Okay, so Craig, I also wish I had wine. I'm like, oh,
Sorry, yeah,
Me
exactly.
too.
You guys are at work, but that never stopped me. But
um, so we're gonna do a lightning round. We just have a few questions, and to answer them as quick as you can. What's our
okay,
time limit, Debbie? Do we have like 10 seconds? Is it like
Oh, I was going to give 60 seconds for the lightning round
for the whole thing.
for the whole thing.
oh for the whole thing? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, this is gonna be okay.
So you tell me when.
I don't even know if I can talk that fast. We're gonna be
Just quick.
so. Favorite author of all time, or start.
Okay.
What movie would you like to adapt into a novel or series?
My own or somebody else's?
Your own or somebody else's?
Tom Jones, Sonny Liston was a friend of mine.
Which character would you like to have dinner or lunch with?
Oh, Bill Denborough.
Who?
From it. Bill Denborough from it.
Oh, from it.
Bill
Oh,
Denborough, yeah.
From your work, a character you
Oh, for
like.
my own work. Oh, Uncle Calvin, sure.
Oh, yeah, that'd be dope. What book were you first forced to read and enjoyed when you were younger?
Where the Red Fern Grows by Wilson Rawls.
So this one's pen and paper or the sweet sounds of the clicky clack keyboard.
I'm gonna have to go clicky clack keyboard.
Clicky clack keyboard. Okay. Monsters or ghosts? Crossbreeds have to have a category though. Like if you kind of do like a morph.
Monsters.
Monsters. Okay.
All right.
We got there.
Done. All right.
Monsters. I think I would probably go with ghost. I don't know which. Could you get rid of ghost? I feel like you really can't get rid of a ghost.
No.
I guess you can't get rid of a ghost. No, I mean, well, there are certain ways. I always thought, if you find their coffin underneath the house or whatever, you can probably maybe do some kind of exorcism or something. There's always a way to get rid of a ghost if you really want.
All right, because I was like, they're gonna always haunt you. That's like the point of a ghost. Like they just won't rest. Whereas a monster, you can probably be like, dude. Do you have a favorite monster movie now that I'm thinking about it, or like a favorite like? Well, you said I'm thinking of one that you already mentioned.
What one's that?
Because you, I think you like it, right? So.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, I didn't see the second part, but I would say, we often amongst horror guys and women talk about like the ones that actually scared us. And for me, it'd be like The Exorcist truly scared me. Jaws truly scared me. The Ring, both of them, but especially the American version. The Grudge, the Japanese version.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, other than that, I mean, there's some very specific ones. There's one called Noroi, the Cursed, which is another, I think, Korean one, which was really creepy. So I think for me, like, I grew up with, American horror, and that had a certain context, to it. And my countryman, David Cronenberg, also has a certain context. But then I saw The Ring, and it opened up this whole new avenue of Japanese, Asian horror, which got their scares in what felt like completely different ways. So it was like great as a 20-something and 30-something to really feel scared again.
Yeah. There's
Hereditary. The Ari Aster one, Hereditary, from a couple years ago, was actually really creepy too.
There's one I didn't think freaked me out, and it always does. The Fog, but the one from the 70s. Is
John Carpenter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had to bring my dog into the room. I was just like, and we live like, seaside, like by the water. So like, I was like freaked out. I was like, no.
I don't know if I've seen that one. I will have to watch it. I saw The Thing, which is great as well. Maybe not scary, but really well done and really wonderful and really thoughtful about how isolation is used as kind of a tool to continue to amp up the tension and scares. So I think as a horror writer, you're always looking for like it's almost like you look at movies and books as engines, and you take them apart and you see how did this work? How did they get, the romance, or how did they get the horror, or how did they get the tension, whatever it was. And I thought the book, actually, the short story by Joseph Campbell, and also the movie were just masterclasses in tension.
Yeah, packed a punch. Carrie, do we have any questions in the chat? And then Debbie and Nadine or Carrie, do you guys have any questions yourself?
Mhm.
There are no questions so far in the chat, but sorry, there's an echo. Sorry about that. So far, there's no questions, but please, patrons, anyone that's watching, if you want to type in some now, you can go ahead.
I had a question because you were talking about monsters and scary movies. In Saturday Night Ghost Club, in the end, the monsters and ghosts that Uncle Calvin is always talking about, in the end, the monsters were real people, what they did to his wife. So I found that fascinating, because we do grow up being scared of those silly monsters, or the monster under the bed. But then when you become an adult, you realize actually you should be scared of real people. So I found that really, I don't know if touched me is the word, but that kind of resonated with me after reading the book.
Yeah, I think that's one of those kind of terrible realizations that we make as we make the turn into adulthood, is that the things that scare my son, for example, like, truthfully, a monster under the bed or a monster in the closet, you kind of wish that those things were there in some weird way, because they're probably less threatening in the end, and maybe more intelligible at some level than the real things that ultimately we understand as adults. We're able to do to one another.
Right. Mm-hmm. Any other? I have another question about Dove.
Sure.
I know in the book, so when Jake becomes older, he realizes that his uncle had these issues because of what happened to him. But I also think how I took it, when he was looking back at his life, he also knew that Dove struggled. Did she have a mental illness? Or because at one point she takes medication. So I feel like as an adult, he realized that something was going on. But as a child, he wasn't sure.
I think you're probably pretty close to it. It kind of goes back to what I said earlier about, once you write the book, it's not yours anymore, and the interpretation that you would come to on it, or anybody else, is going to be potentially slightly different. I think some of it is with writing is you put clues in there, or you put guideposts, whatever you want to call them. So, like, if you're asking me honestly, I think she had struggles, and her mom was aware of it, and her mom was doing her best to try and deal with a really creative, sort of a person who just probably felt like she was in the wrong place. I think one thing about growing up in a smaller town is you ran across these, honestly, men and women now, but boys and girls back then, it was just like, this is not the place for me. I belong somewhere else. And when you feel like you're tied to that, then it manifests itself, I think, in ways that are unhealthy, and you're just trying to break free in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of, again, the novels that I write have a lot to do with that too, of like feeling like you're not in the wrong skin exactly, but you're in the wrong place, and that you belong elsewhere, and maybe you're fated for bigger things. And the scary part is to discover that maybe that impression is wrong. And I guess it's never really said whether Dove gets what she's looking for or not. There's so much of the nostalgia that I find of the books I love is actually built into the not knowing. Is that you're not actually given a clear picture of what happens, and you're left to sort of sort through your own emotions on it, just like you're left to sort through your own emotions on your own life and history and the people that you shared it with.
Right.
Wow. Well said. That's a good note to end on. We don't have any further questions. And oh, wait, we do have one comment. Erin said, I love this book. The characters really came alive for me and the story was really moving. Thank you for coming to talk about it with us. Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you, Erin. That was a perfect comment to end the program. So let me end the recording here.